So let's talk about Europe today. For almost 2 years, we have seen the economic destruction of the EU. People are getting poorer, farmers, they're protesting, and industries, they are all in crisis. The EU has made a lot of mistakes, they are tanking their economy and just breaking apart their societies. Everything with the Americans, siding with the Americans has been a mistake. It has cost Europe almost everything. And it's really interesting to see Macron having a meltdown over this. Europe is in mortal danger, and the French president wants to lead the EU out of economic hell. In a shocking speech in Paris, Macron announced that Europe is on the brink of destruction, that our Europe can die. He reminded everyone that the choice going forward will determine if the EU survives or if it's a situation of total collapse. If we look back at the past 2 years, the main driver of European industry is gone. Cheap Russian gas has been cut away. Now, before the war, around 40% of Europe's gas came from Moscow. Today, it is less than 10%. The advantage Europe used to have is now flowing to Asia, specifically China. While gas prices have dropped, the discount Beijing is getting allows their economy to pull well ahead of the EU. Russian supply is flowing to China at a 28% discount versus Europe. And that's why Chinese exports like solar panels and EVs, they are flooding the world at cheaper prices. Because of lower input costs, companies in China can manufacture goods at a much cheaper rate. Europe simply can't compete. Over a quarter of Beijing's total gas imports are from cheap Russian supply, and the volumes are only going to increase. In 2024, China paid around $260 for 1,000 cubic meters of gas. Europe paid around 320. That's 25% more than Beijing. By 2027, this disparity will only grow. The EU will have to pay almost 40% more for any Russian supply. While it's true that they can buy gas from the US and Qatar, prices will be way higher versus China. And because of the decisions made and the EU being part of NATO, there's simply no U-turn back to Russia. The only way left is forward, and Macron clearly outlines this in his speech. The era of basing our production in China, of delegating our defense to the US, and of getting our energy from Russia is over. The rules of the game have changed. Macron is lashing out against the US and China. Because of the conflict, Europe is suffering the most. China's huge population base and manufacturing power are overpowering Europe. And on the other front, the US is pushing Europe towards a crazy asset grab with Russia. They want Europe to seize over $260 billion sitting in Euroclear, the EU financial system. And it's so risky that even the ECB is saying this is a bad idea. It will doom Europe. Confiscating the assets will hurt the EU more than the US. We are witnessing Europe getting pushed around like a pinball in a pinball machine, and Macron has had enough. I take China for example. For almost a year, Europe has been waffling around. They have been criticizing China, but at the same time booking monthly flights to visit Beijing. The Chinese aren't really taking Europe seriously because they are becoming mouthpieces of the US. Even Macron realizes that the world isn't treating Europe like an independent power. He wants Europe to show that it's never going to be a vassal for the US when he speaks to other regions of the world. And as dramatic as this sounds, he's not wrong. Europe has to show the world that they are European and not an outpost of the US on another continent. And if we look at the actions of the EU countries, it's shocking how compliant they are with US foreign policy. And the biggest example we have is the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline. Now, when the pipeline blew up, it took down 55 billion cubic meters of supply from Russia to Germany. And because of the risk, another pipeline, the Nord Stream 2, was also shut down. And this led to over 100 billion of cheap Russian gas being cut away from Berlin. But until today, we have seen little interest from Schultz to investigate what truly happened. Who really did it? Until today, Germany has no clear answer. Denmark and Sweden, they've also dropped their investigations. There's simply no urgency across Europe. Even though this led to the deindustrialization of Germany, no one really seems to care, which is really bizarre. Another great example is America using Europe as a pawn in their agenda against China. Europe is caught in Biden's war for global hegemony. For many months, the US has been telling their allies to squeeze China further. They are telling EU countries like the Netherlands and Germany to punish Beijing, to tighten technology restrictions on China. ASML, a Dutch chipmaker, relies heavily on China for their exports. Even after the export controls ordered by the US, China is still the company's biggest market. Beijing accounts for over 40% of the company's total sales. Even after the curbs, they are still the biggest buyer of chip making tools in the world. By restricting sales to China, the company is hitting their own revenue base, which will impact their profits as well. It's examples like this that really make the world question who is in charge of European policy. Can Europe really make independent decisions when dealing with the world? Or must everything go through the US and get approval from Joe Biden? Macron knows this is a big problem, this is the case, and that's why he's calling for Europe to be a balancing power. He wants the EU to sit between the US and China to trade with both sides and to extract benefits from both as well. And that is exactly what Europe should do, but it's easier said than done. Macron's plan for this, of course, is very vague. He doesn't give much details, but to make this happen, Europe will need a lot of money. They have to take on a lot of debt and break away from their fiscal responsibility. Now, the first step, according to Macron, is to move away from the US defense umbrella. To fund Macron's war economy, the EU will have to spend a ton of money. The biggest threat, of course, is Russia. Moscow is spending around 4.4% of their GDP on defense. However, many EU countries are drastically below the 2% annual minimum. France and Germany are at 1.6%. Italy is at 1.5%. Even Spain is only at 1.2%. To fund this new war economy, the money will have to come from debt. If the EU wants to do this now, the timing is simply horrible. Their economies are in shambles. The EU expects GDP to expand by only 0.8% this year. They've revised their forecast down because European industries simply can't compete. Taking additional debt now would be very dangerous. When government borrows money, they compete with the real economy for capital, and this pushes borrowing costs up across the board, which could be horrible for European manufacturing and all their other businesses. To catch up with Russia, the EU would need 4% of their GDP diverted to defense, and this would spike each member's debt to GDP to crazy levels. Germany would hit 83%, France at 145%, and Italy hitting 180%. And this is something Europe simply can't afford. Unlike the US, they don't have the reserve currency. The higher their debt goes, the harder it will be to pay back their existing burden. Future borrowing will also be compromised. Just ask Japan. Macron might have the best intentions, but a war economy isn't the best solution. Europe will have to choose their battles very wisely. They can focus on civilian industries or the military industrial complex. Trying to do both simply isn't possible. Now, Macron is very ambitious. He wants Europe to be a world leader by 2030. He wants investments in five strategic areas: artificial intelligence, quantum computing, space, biotechnologies, and new energies. Honestly, this sounds very far fetched. It's not possible for the way Europe is structured today. To unleash his Star Wars dream, he needs a united Europe and, more importantly, a united budget. But that isn't possible because Europe's economies are still very weak. Taking on more debt today is simply unthinkable. Now, to save Europe's economy, Macron has to work closer with China. It's a no brainer, and this will be the first test of true European sovereignty. China will outweigh the entire G7 as the leading driver of global economic growth. For the next 5 years till 2029, China will account for 21% of the world's total GDP growth. China's economic activity will overwhelm the G7, not just the US, Germany, or France, but all of them combined. Beijing will have the world's biggest industrial base and consumer markets, and that's what Europe really needs to rely on. You cooperate with China to manufacture cheap products and then you sell back into their enormous consumer market. And if we look at the car market in China, we can see foreign car makers like Germany losing market share. Local Chinese automakers are now accounting for 50% of car sales. A big part of that is higher prices. Chinese cars, especially EVs, are 50% the price of EU brands. The only way to compete now is to move their factories from Europe all the way to China, and then you can benefit from complete vertical integration in manufacturing. Your products get cheaper, you can export more products, and the quality will improve. All these are needed to revive European industries, and the EU better move fast. Despite Biden condemning China and telling everyone to stay away, we just need to look at the actions of US companies. They know where the future lies. Just after Blinken's visit, Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, went to Beijing. There's a reason why he met with the Chinese Premier Li Qiang. It's all about working closer with China to improve their technology and access the Chinese market. And guess what? China was receptive. Tesla is now going to partner with the Chinese company Baidu. They're going to work on mapping and navigation technologies. And this allows Tesla to roll out self-driving cars in China eventually and capture a bigger market. And this is a market that the Eurozone will lose to the US. These are the blind spots Europe still has. Countries like Germany and bureaucrats like von der Leyen are still hyping up the China threat, and that is to the detriment of European industries and companies. The idea of the EU catching up against China is not feasible. Building supply chains take time. Deploying money also isn't easy. There's a ton of trial and error to get things right, and that once again requires a ton of money and time. For the industries of tomorrow, China is leading the world. The EU has invested $360 billion into renewable technologies. The US has poured in $300 billion. But China is on a totally different scale. They are different beasts. They have nearly $680 billion invested into the future of energy transition. It's simply not feasible to compete with China on quality and price. And because of their previous investment, China has an incredibly large lead versus the entire world. They have already done the groundwork. Directly competing is impossible, and that's why it's better to partner with them. If Europe understands this, it could change everything. There's nothing wrong with leaning on China to build up your own economy. So, will Europe take Macron's advice? Probably not until the Russia Ukraine conflict ends. The EU is still busy drafting new sanctions on Russian energy, which, as we all know, will boomerang back on their economy. Europe is now thinking of sanctioning Russian LNG projects, and this includes banning EU ports from receiving Russian fuels and targeting the shadow fleet as well. And once again, this is a silly idea that won't hurt Putin. It will just hurt Europe's energy supply. Gas will simply flow to Asia and China, and the EU will have to pay even more. In 2024 so far, Europe imported nearly 5 million tons of Russian LNG, and that's more than 16% of their total LNG supply. If Russia decides to divert this away to retaliate against the sanctions, this will hurt EU industries even more. And if you think about it, Europe's sinking economy is a result of their own actions. Macron is simply verbalizing their frustration. They are filled with a lot of regret, resentment, and anger. And he kinda knows Europe is trapped, and unless they course correct, the ship will sink even faster. They've already hit the iceberg. It's now a matter of launching the lifeboats and swimming to shore. But as always, let me know what you think. Can Europe do a U-turn and save their economy? Or is it really too late for Macron and the Eurozone? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these desperate times.